Well, hello there. My name is Shane Lopes. I'm a live action portrait photographer as well as an on-location portrait photographer. And well, today I thought I'd talk to you all about the basics of photography and kind of go over the lingo that a lot of us photographers use. Hopefully it's going to help you out trying to getting into the photography realm. And also if you want to start shooting concert photography, maybe it'll help you out there as well. So for today, I'm going to go over the basics of a professional DSLR camera. Kind of go over the lingo, how they work, all their functions, and kind of what I use when I take a lot of concert photography. So first off, we're going to start off with the term DSLR camera. Now this is a DSLR camera. It's short for digital single lens reflex camera. And obviously it's digital because it's digital camera, and single lens reflex because inside this camera is a little tiny mirror right there. Now that mirror sees through this lens and bounces off what this lens sees through the viewfinder. So pretty much when I look through this viewfinder, I see exactly what the lens sees. That's why they call it a single lens reflex camera. And then when you click the shutter button, like that, the mirror pops down, exposing the sensor inside the camera and developing your picture. So if anyone refers to a DSLR camera, they're pretty much just talking about any kind of camera like this that has, I guess, pretty much an interchangeable lens would be the easiest way to identify it. So yeah, if you have any kind of camera where you can take the lens off and switch it out like that, it's pretty much considered DSLR. Now they do have some pretty new point and shoot cameras, Sony and Nikon and Canon are making, which they do have interchangeable lenses. But those, you don't really have a viewfinder like this, so it's still really considered a point and shoot, even though it does have an interchangeable lens. But yeah, just look for the big cameras, and that's how you know it's a DSLR. That's if you're really basic. And yeah, this one right here is Nikon. It's a Nikon D300S. For concert photography, I prefer Nikon. Nikon has a really good noise reduction, which I'm going to talk about later on. And noise reduction is pretty much key and essential for shooting concert photography. So with your DSLR camera, there's three variables which will affect your exposure. You have shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Now with digital cameras nowadays, you have the full option of choosing which ISO you want to shoot on, which is awesome. Back in the day with film, you'd have to select the film you want for your ISO. So if I wanted to shoot on 100 ISO, I'd have to get that type of film. If I wanted to shoot on 800 ISO film, I'd have to have that kind of film. Now, if digital, it's just a matter of hitting this little button and switching over to the ISO I want, which is great. Now, I'm going to start off with talking about shutter speed. Shutter speed is the duration that the shutter of the camera is open. So, if you have a really short shutter speed, that means more light's going to come through, and you're going to have more light on your exposure. The longer the shutter speed, the less light that comes through. Now, the plus to that is the longer the shutter speed, the less light comes in, but the shutter is not open nearly as long, so you can capture really fast-moving objects or a lot of motion. So if I want to capture, like, some BMXing or something like that, I want to use a really fast shutter speed because it's going to be able to capture that high-speed motion. On the downside, not as much light's going to come in, so I'm going to have to balance out my exposure and compensate for that. Now, when you're shooting, when I shoot concert photography, I typically want to shoot usually at a shutter speed of 1/100th of a second. That usually helps capture a lot of the motion that the performers are going to have. The downside to that is when you're shooting concerts, there's a lot of really low light conditions, and you're going to want to use as slow as a shutter speed as possible to let in as much light as possible. Now, I can't really use that slow of a shutter speed, else all of my subjects would just come out really blurry. So you kind of got to balance things out in order to make up for that. Now, some people might shoot as low as, I don't know, maybe a 30th of a second. That's going to let in a lot more light, but your subjects are just going to be really blurry, and you're not going to be able to capture a lot of the motion that they have, unless you're shooting maybe like an acoustic set where they're not moving too much. But if you're shooting a lot of rock concerts like I like to shoot, they're moving around all over the place, so you got to use a fast shutter speed. So like I said, I recommend probably 100 or faster if possible. Sometimes I'll shoot at 200th of a second, but that's if there's a lot of light being pushed through on the stage. So it kind of depends on the lighting situation. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is aperture. Aperture can be a little confusing just because of the way that we identify it. Aperture is also known as f-stops. So if you hear someone talking about the f-stop of their camera, like I want you to shoot at f8, they're talking about the aperture width. So this is a little confusing. Well, maybe not for you guys, but for me it was really confusing for starting off. The lower the number of aperture, the wider open it is. So if I had an aperture of 4, the lens is going to be pretty wide open. If I have an aperture of, say, f22, it's going to be really small. Now, the advantages and disadvantages of this is with a wide aperture, say at f4 or f2.8, it's going to be really wide open, so it's going to let in a lot more light. And that's exactly what you're going to want for shooting concert photography. Now, a lot of people, you might be thinking like, well, why even have like f22? Well, the smaller your aperture, the bigger the depth of field. And the wider your aperture, the more shallow depth of field. Now, what I mean by depth of field is, say you're looking at my finger right now. If I had a really shallow depth of field, say at like 2.8, you'd get my finger in focus, but all of me in the background, I'd be totally blurry and out of focus. If you had a really high aperture, like f22, you could get my finger in focus and still have my whole face in focus. So that's kind of the disadvantage and advantage of having a lower or higher aperture. You get a shallower depth of field or a more narrow depth of field. So that's kind of how aperture works. Now, people also talk about the fastness of your lens. So when someone says they have a really fast lens, that means they have a really low aperture lens. So what I mean by that is, if someone asks how fast your lens is, that means what's the lowest aperture your lens can perform at. So a lot of lenses, they'll either go anywhere from, probably the lowest lens I've ever seen is an f1, and that can vary anywhere from like f1 to f4 for a low end. So the cheaper lenses, they'll typically be at f4 because it's easier to make them that way. The more expensive higher end lenses, they'll be lower, maybe at f2.8, maybe f1.4, or even f1 like I said. This lens right here is it's a f2.8, so the lowest aperture on it is 2.8. Now that's really good for shooting concert photography because f2.8 lets in a pretty good amount of light for those low light conditions, which helps allow me to use a faster shutter speed. Since less light's coming in through the shutter, I need to have a wider aperture to let in more light and give me a proper exposure. So when you're shooting concert photography, you want to have a really fast lens. So you want to have a really low aperture lens, which is great. You know, sometimes I'll shoot with even like a 1.4, which lets in a lot of light. However, the disadvantage of shooting with a really low aperture lens is that the wider your lens is, like I said, the more shallow the depth of field, so it's harder to get things in focus. So especially if you have a subject that's moving around and jumping all over the place, it makes things a lot more harder to get them in focus. So that's typically why I like to shoot at 2.8, because f2.8, it's not extremely shallow to where it's impossible to get your subject in focus. Yeah, it's still pretty easy to get in focus, and it still lets in a lot of light. So yeah, I'd recommend shooting with a lens probably f2.8 if you can find them. You know, they're not always the cheapest lenses, unfortunately. Now, the third thing we're going to talk about is the ISO. The ISO on your camera is pretty much the sensitivity of your sensor. So it's the amount of light, it's how sensitive it is to light. So the higher the ISO, the more sensitive light your sensor becomes. Now, the downside to that is the higher the ISO, the more grainy your image also becomes. So if I'm doing like a portrait session of somebody, if I'm taking a portrait of like a band or a person, I want my ISO to be really low. Preferably with Nikon, I want the lowest it can go is ISO 200. So I'll probably be shooting at ISO 200 when doing portraits because there'll be very, very little, hardly any grain in the image, which is exactly what you want. It gives you a nice, clean looking image. Now, when shooting concert photography, you don't exactly have that option because the light levels are so low, you have to really crank up that ISO. Whenever I'm shooting concert photography, I'll typically be shooting probably at ISO 3200 to ISO 4000. I'll really be boosting it up there. So I'm trying to get as much light exposure as possible because I want to use, like I said, the fastest shutter speed as possible and if possible, a larger shutter aperture so I have more depth of field. So yeah, that's kind of how ISO works. Pretty simple. You can just adjust it on your camera. Now, some cameras, they can't even go to 3200, some of the lower end ones. So, you know, if your camera can't do that, don't worry about it. Just work with what you got. And yeah. So if you use any kind of post-production software, you might be worried about, you know, the higher my ISO is, the more noise I have. And some people really don't like noise. Well, you can always eliminate noise in post-production. So it's not that big of a problem. I kind of like the noise look. It makes the images look a lot more kind of like grungy and grimy. I kind of like that whole look. So yeah, so that's why I have no problem boosting my ISO up all the way up there and helping capture more light. So yeah. Yeah, those are pretty much the basics of how a DSLR camera works. You got your aperture, you got your shutter speed, and you got your ISO. And like I said, typically whenever I shoot a concert, I'm shooting at an aperture of 2.8, a shutter speed of 100, and I'll have my ISO probably at 3200 to 4000. And that helps capture my subjects in those low light conditions and gives me the cool images I like. So yeah, if you have any other questions about cameras, photography, lighting, anything photography related, feel free to message me and I'll try and respond to you as quick as possible. I'll probably be putting some more videos up, probably outlining the basics of becoming a concert photographer, how you can get there, and what you should do to get there. And yeah, let me know if you like this video. It's a little rushed, but anyways, if you like it, just let me know and I'll put some more up. If not, tell me what I should improve on and I'll work on it. So yeah, see you guys later.